In a recent article, the New York Times reported that once again, we as Americans need to have concerns with the ethical behavior of our politicians. For this particular story, the question that's emerged is whether or not members of our United States Congress have been using their position as a way of either manipulating or influence policy for their financial gain, or to use the information they get from their positions as a way of boosting their own portfolios. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Shawn H. Williams, and thank you for joining us once again for another exciting season of KIPP Senior Seminar at Campbellsville University. I have here joining me today 4 of our fantastic political science majors who are all graduating seniors. And we're here to have a conversation about this question of ethics in American politics or in democratic politics in general, and try to understand, first of all, what maybe some of the influence or impact of low levels of ethics might have on politics, and also to see if there's anything that can be done about it. Are there any steps that we can take in the United States as citizens to protect us from the ethical behavior of our politicians and candidates? So to get started, I want to kind of throw a question out to the panel and let each of you get a chance to talk about it if you want to. Before we can really address what bad ethical behavior is, we should probably understand whether or not there is such a thing as ethics and whether or not we can apply an ethical standard to politics. So for each of you guys, what do you understand ethics to be, and what do you think that ethical standard should be?
I think ethical standards should be defined by the group that is, being presented in the like in the social setting. So, for example, I guess for our candidates, the House of Representatives actually has a code of conduct that they use for their ethics to have like this set standard for what they do. I think it just more is defined by the group. So like for society, I guess it's just a general consumption, like a general consensus of what the ethical standard should be. But I would argue that it depends on the group setting of what the ethical standard should be. And a kind of a consensus of everybody.
I like that you mentioned it could be different based on like what kind of group setting you're in. And I think particularly in your paper, Zach, when you highlighted ethics as meaning well-founded standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of obligations, benefits to society, fairness, or specific virtues. I think that's important, especially when looking at ethics in politics. I think they have a certain level of responsibility to people and an obligation to fill out their roles sufficiently. So I think ethics, when studied in politics, as you were saying that it's different based on your setting, is important to make sure that they're making decisions that benefit everybody and not just making those that benefit themselves financially or towards their reelection.
Good point, everybody, and I also echo your takes on this. I believe that ethics in politics means the moral the moral judgments of political actions and its agents. In this case, will be elected officials and as well as government officials. I feel that it should be very important to have and maintain these ethics in our government system to build trust and also to make sure that we have accountability to be able to tell that this is wrong and this is bad, so that way our political system can be trustworthy.
I always liked defining like ethics as like a set of moral principles that somebody abides by. And so the difficulty with that is that last time I checked on Google, it said like there's over 300 million people that live in the United States. So the difficulty is like not really defining ethics, but mostly just lies with like what is ethical.
I pointed that out at the end of my brief too, that it's really hard to define ethics because I specifically stated in at least in the end of mine that one person's like beliefs could be another's, could be their neighbor's like death threat for something that they believe. So and it's different. It's different with the implication of cultures around the world as well, and different things that have happened. So it's really hard. I agree with Savannah. It's really hard to like define ethics in the case just because of how much like disparity there can be between just even in same countries, different regions just have different ways that their culture was represented and how they would grow up and what their parents taught them, what their parents taught them, and how things are organized. It's really hard to define ethics and have a solidified like kind of this is what ethics means. This is what or this is what our ethics are. This is what our morals are, kind of deal, because they can be different from person to person, group to group, anything like that.
Since we were talking about just it being different from like person to person, what the ethics mean, I think something really interesting to consider is like the idea of each political party as we're talking about electing candidates that display a minimum ethical standard. Party to party, what do ethics mean for that specific party? Because on one side of an issue such as abortion, ethics to a more left-leaning politician or citizen can mean having an abortion to save the life of the mother to prevent the child from growing up in a society where they don't want a child to grow up. On the other side, a more right-leaning person could take the same argument and their ethical standing could be to have the child because that's a life. And so when discussing this too, you have to think about both sides and how their what their standard of ethics might be and how their ethical test might differ between party to party.
That's an excellent point. So does that mean that it isn't possible to hold everyone in society to an ethical standard? Can you say that we have to hold all of our politicians to an ethical standard if, as Zach and Savannah were suggesting, that there's no such thing as a national ethic in the United States?
I was discussing in my brief that I think most people have a general moral and ethical standard that they hold in their own person, and I think that there is a general level of ethics that we can expect from society as a whole, and I think that that's big stuff that everybody would agree on, especially as someone who's coming into a leadership position. As I was doing my research, I found that it was really important for a leadership to be ethical and that maintains their connections with not only their subordinates but also their coworkers, and it can help them be more successful.
What do the rest of you guys think? Is it possible to have a common ethical standard if, as y'all suggest, ethics is so fractionalized?
Yes, I believe at some point as a society, we may contain a common ethical standards. That is simply because one, we want order and make sure that we're harmless toward each other. So at the same time, I believe that what Bethany said earlier on is correct because everybody it's not just in the United States. Everybody has it, his or her sources of morality. And in this case, if as we're discussing about ethics in politics, I believe that our leaders should, it's their duty to reflect the image and the reputation of our political systems. If we want a corrupt free government, that must be seen among in our leaders, in our elected officials. So that is my take on that.
I think it's important. Oops, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
As I was saying, it's important too to hold any person in power, even if they're not political representatives, to an ethical and moral standard, because you're representing the whole country. You're representing your people in the your precinct and your counties, your cities, your towns. Like, you're representing everybody. So if it's okay to like have the ethical standard from the area where you grow up, and it could be different from if you go to DC and have that, or your state legislature or anything like that, wherever you represent. But it's important to have a general consensus of a good moral compass and a good ethical standard while taking office, because you're representing everybody. So if you're representing people and you do something bad, that looks not only bad on yourself, but it looks bad on the town or the county, the precinct, the area that you're representing, and it just could like destroy kind of what people think about yourself and the people you represent, just depending on what you do and why you did it.
I think that's a good point, and I think further than just examining like their viewpoints and where they stand on certain issues, ethics even gets into how the candidates for office like treat people, how they campaign, how they get their money. And I think that idea, so like holding someone to an ethical standard isn't necessarily just what is their viewpoint on this issue, but it's how do they work through this problem? How do they approach the situation? And do they do that in like a way that is like standard or is held to an ethical standard that's recognized by many people?
Do you think in a democracy that kind of information is helpful to us? The way that a person behaves in their private life, the way that they behave during a political campaign, do you think that it informs the way that they would behave if we were to elect them in public office and give them public trust? Or do you think that a person can just like flip a switch and we can say, well, just because you were kind of a shrewd or underhanded business person doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to behave that way if we give you access to the public coffer?
I believe that our homes are the foundation of our moral and character. And of course, if you are a person whose morals are one-sided and you are now pursuing a career in public service, you will one thing you will try to do is that you'll have to make sure that you know your base and how to appear and persuade them. So you can use a tactic, but at the end of the day, I believe that your true self will one day come to its manifestation, and that may be good or bad based on your character and your ethics, and therefore may somehow impact the system and the society at large.
I know in one of the papers that I cited for my brief was the Politician's Dilemma, What's Represented by Thomas R. Ireland. And in the very first sentence of the introduction, he goes, there is a very old controversy in the annals of political science over whether a politician should seek to represent the will of his constituents or seek to represent in his judgment of the best interests of his constituency, or in alternate versions, his nation or his world. And I think that is important too, because you represented, like you were talking about earlier about flipping a switch, and it's a very it's a constant dilemma that was pointed out in this paper, and it's it's not like super obvious, but it definitely is something that I think all politicians have to deal with, or any person of power has to deal with, when trying to figure out what he's going to present himself to the public versus, or present themselves to the public versus presenting themselves in a closed encased area where they are voting on rights, or not rights, voting on legislature and different kinds of things. I think it's very important to think about that they do have that ongoing, do I vote for myself, for my people, for my reelection, or do I vote for my best interest because I'm going to get a better tax break out of it? My peers are going to get a better tax break out of it. That means they're going to donate more money to my reelection campaign, or they're going to donate more money to my party, stuff like that, because that'll also, depend on, that'll constitute whether they're voting yes or no on the bill that's being passed, or something just getting through their, through their legislature.
If a politician's party has complete control, or nearly complete control, over their area, it's gonna be pretty hard to vote them out if they're being unethical. Because I've met some people, they don't really bother to even look at the names on the ballots. They just either mark straight Republican or straight Democrat, and then they vote.
I mean, and that's a fair point. This question of that Ms. Davis had alluded to, the question of party polarization. If, as some of y'all had suggested, partisanship creates separate communities, and different communities have different ethics, if our various political parties, our two dominant political parties in our society, have two different sets of ethical norms or ethical values, then can ethics fairly be used as a judgment for political behavior? Or really, are we just saying, are you a good Republican or are you a good Democrat? Is that the only ethics that matters?
Some people, yeah.
Now, another thing related to this question of polarization, and I guess also related to ethical behavior, is the role of media in all of this. The last couple of decades have seen increasing cries on the part of citizens that our media outlets have become too politically biased, or that our media outlets themselves aren't using ethics. Do you think that there's a place for the media to try to highlight ethical strengths or weaknesses of candidates for public office, or the individuals who hold public office? Or do you think that the media should basically stay out of questions of ethics or morality when presenting the facts of politics to the American people?
I feel as if sometimes when ethics are put on display by media, it's for the gain of their own company. So I think sometimes they choose to report things only when it's going to make themselves look better. For example, different companies reporting on different things. But I think that media is a good thing when highlighting, especially politicians' ethics and things, because a lot of the time, even though we are still getting a biased opinion from that, because the news is going to be biased in that, it's still giving us a deeper level of information than we had before regarding the politicians' ethics, I think. And if the media was to just stay out of it, we might not have as much knowledge about what's going on behind the scenes.
The media actually is one of the components that I believe that should be connect the public and the government, and it's their duty to expose the misconduct that are taking place in the government. But today, this is not a case, every media company has an agenda that they push. They select what to report and what not to, based on the agendas. So I believe that the media also contributes in the whole notion of ethics when it comes to our government officials, because there's medias who protect these officials and they don't hold them accountable and report the news as it's supposed to because of their agendas. So I believe it's up to the media and also to keep that relationship going and then be trustworthy to the public as well.
Do you think when candidates misstep in their ethics and it's reported by the media that it makes it harder for them to overcome because of the media attention that was given to it? Or do you think that gives them a sense of responsibility to not make that mistake again?
I believe that one of the things that the media does good at this is it brings awareness among the public. Uh, so in this case, for example, let's say an elected official has been caught in doing some or partaking in some unethical behaviors, and his or her party is in control of the House and Senate, the chances that this official will be held accountable are not as much. But with attention from the media and the involvement of the public, I think at some point the leadership of this party in power can do something to at least clean their names.
What about the rest of you? What do you think the appropriate role for the media should be? And do you feel like that they're living up to the responsibilities of their role?
I feel like the media has a lot to do with how polarized the country is right now. And I do know that journalists, they usually have a certain set of ethical guidelines that they go by. I'm not so sure what they are, but I know that they do have them. But one really big issue with the media is that what they report is often controlled by, whoever owns them or whatever group of people owns them. So if the owner of a certain media company doesn't like what one reporter wants to report, they won't allow them to do it because they own the company and they're allowed to do that.
I was going to say earlier that I like the days before where I believe it was the Information Act. I could be wrong on the total name of it. It was passed in the 60s where news stations and TV stations, if they wanted to have a political issue be brought up on their broadcast, they had to spend the same amount of time that they did presenting the opposite subject. So if they spent 15 minutes, campaigning for or harping against elective or an issue, they had to spend another 15 minutes. I don't know if it was directly after, but they had to spend another 15 minutes later presenting the other side of that issue. Obviously now you have there's the only real unguided super neutral is like AP Press. There's some that are maybe leaning a little bit left or leaning a little bit right, but more neutral than others. And it's really hard without those neutral sources to have someone who can see the positives in both electors or both people who are running in the campaign or who are in the office. I think it's hard to see positives and negatives in both rather than just seeing just positives in one and just negatives in another because of the like Savannah alluded to earlier, the control that people have over different media, the media industries that can or cannot publish, even though they have ethical guidelines for the journalists. That the media, some of the, depending on which company you're writing for, can or cannot publish what it is just at will, because they want to or they don't want to, because it could ruin or help a representation of one party or the other, or one candidate or the other that maybe had ties to the media company or whatnot.
Now, one argument that was proposed, and I think a lot of these have come out as a result of the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections. But one argument that was proposed is that we change the rules for campaigns for national elections and place greater requirements on candidates. One suggestion was that we require them to release their tax data or their financial holdings. Another suggestion has been that we require all candidates for national office, House, Senate, or President to take some kind of an ethics test or complete an ethical questionnaire, so that we as a society can get a sense of whether or not that person can be trusted. Before we get into the weeds on this, in general, what do you think of this idea? The idea that we should require candidates to verify their ethical nature for us before we are allowed to vote for them?
I think that, go ahead, Savannah, I'm sorry.
Okay. I think like it's a good idea, but like we were talking about before, it's like hard to define like exactly what is ethical, especially when you work your way up to a larger government. Like at the regional level, like it'd probably be easier because the population is so much smaller. But as the population gets bigger, it gets more difficult. And plus, I think that if a politician is unethical, I think they kind of out themselves for it, because I remember one time there was one particular politician, I'm not going to say who it was, but basically they were harassing a mass shooting survivor. And that's definitely unethical in my opinion. And a lot of people were getting angry at this particular person over that, especially because I believe at the time the survivor was still a minor. So that just make that particular politician look really bad.
I think trying to come up with an ethical test that would test somebody and like in a good enough way, but also being general enough to encompass a lot of things around both political parties. I think that would be really difficult, but once it is fine-tuned, I think it could be very helpful for candidates. Hopefully the test would help them actually stick to what they're campaigning for, or at least be honest in their representation of what they want to do in office. If they have something else to compare it to, an ethical test to compare it to. That being said, it is really difficult because of the different definitions on ethics, especially with the different parties' definitions. And if there's a president from somebody's party that they don't align with, they might already be under the impression that the politician might lie on the ethics test, or think that the ethics test isn't substantial enough to prove anything. But I think if there was a way that it could be done well, I think it would be very beneficial.
Yeah, I agreed on the like I think it would be very beneficial. It'd be hard to implement because of there's a lot of difficulties with implementing ethical tests that are about when was the lying or just being able to falsify your test. It's really hard to prove or disprove if someone was being truthful or not on their tests. And I even most of them I would assume would just be short answers, explaining what they would do in a certain situation. And it would just be like, I think they're beneficial because it will show if answered truthfully, which is a lot to ask, it would show the public a type of person they're voting for. But it would also, like, even if they quote like failed a test, I don't think it would be fair to like disallow them to run or continue to not run, because then it would just show other people around the world like who, even if they like failed the test by a generalized ethical standard that is being held, or generalized moral standard that is being held, it can show people around the area who voted for that politician that like, oh, maybe these people aren't, you know, the best people to work with or work for, because their ethical standards or moral standards are also not that great, because they represented someone like who failed the test in our books, because failing is like we said, it's very subjectable, because you can't really fail an ethics test, but you can definitely have a lot of bad answers, you know, person to person.
I am against the notion of implementing ethics text, simply because I believe that, and when I was writing my paper, I actually come across this great study that stated that the majority of the public, and I really do believe this, know and understand that the majority of our elected officials run to public office for their own gain. It's more of their interest or personal interest than it is of the society at large. So this means that any generalized test that can be put in place, if these officials know the minimum and what it takes or what to answer to pass this exam, despite their beliefs, despite how unethical they are, I feel like it would be easy for them to even pass this text. And for thanks to constitutions and other democratic institutions, today those ethics texts are left on the voters. They're the one who get to decide based on what they think of that candidate. So, and I believe that it should be left on them as well.
I think passing or not passing an ethical test shouldn't just be like an examination of answers to questions, but a statistical analysis of like where their answers stood and what they mean in terms of the question that they were answering, and not just did they answer this question to my level of satisfaction, because obviously that's up to the feelings of a bunch of different people. But if it's more of a statistical analysis, I think it would be more helpful in discovering what the answers to the test actually mean.
And there are tests too that don't really have a specific answer. The one that a lot of people are familiar with is the trolley problem, where if you flip the switch, there's a trolley coming on railroads, and there's two separate railroads. One has 5 people, one has 1, and you flip a switch to save 1, or you flip a switch to save the 5, and kill the 1 or kill the 5. There are a lot of different answers to that test, or to that that question, but there's not a specific yes, this is the right answer. This is the right answer. So along with how Bethany said that, I agree with the I really like that point that I didn't even think about in my brief, of comparing them to a statistical analysis of other people's answers, where you can kind of get your basis for how ethical or not ethical they are. There's a lot of questions too that don't really have a yes or no answer, or a yes, I would do this, no, I would do this, just plainly without an explanation. And with those explanations, you would get what they believe and what they do, because you can't really just answer the trolley question with a yes, I would flip the switch to save the one person, because then they're like, well, what about the one person? What if it was like your mom, or what if it was a millionaire who said he would give you $1,000 if you saved him, versus there's different ways to think about all this stuff, and applying it with the statistical analysis versus tests that don't have yes or no straight answers is in my opinion a really good way to kind of help guide the right direction in showing political candidates like versus their own like moral and ethical standards usually.
For just a few seconds, I still believe that despite how these statistical analysis will be run, no, I don't believe no result of this ethics text can help us predict how well these elected officials or these candidates will perform their job. I still believe that to be true.
That is 100% true because you can't predict it at all. I think the whole point of the test, at least that I was brought up, is it's going to help voters see more of the political candidate that they're voting for, rather than you can't really put an ethical standards test on a person that's already in office because they're already in control of the office until they have to go through your election. I think it's more for the voters than it is, predicting, I know that this person is going to vote yes on the abortion bill, or they're going to vote no on the tax cut bill, I think that you're 100% correct. It's just more of I think it's just more for the voters' confidence in who they're voting for.
In the few minutes that we have left, I'm going to ask you guys one more question. I'm going to ask each of you guys to answer it for me. If you're leaning in the direction that something like an ethical test can't be used and that it's ultimately up to the voters to decide what the ethical standard should be, do you feel like there's anything that we can do, any controls that we can implement to limit the impact of bad ethical behavior on the part of our candidates? Or do you think that really it's just the voters get to decide and let's hope for the best?
I think that question is simple. When I was doing my internship at the General Assembly, one thing that we had to do was we had to read a little book of House and the Senate rules. These are the ethics rules that they operate upon. And these are for the sake of the reputation of the system or the government, to be more precise. To put control in order to prevent or avoid unethical candidates to be elected to office, I think at some point, it will be against what the founders of this republic aimed at. Is up to the voters to decide whether X or Y should be our leader in our district. And that power should not be taken away from the people. It's supposed to be as it is.
I agree that I think the public has a certain responsibility to contribute to the democratic process. And I think having some control in that process, help them elect a leader that then benefits them and then benefits the leader as they can then move forward in re-election.
Savannah, what are your thoughts?
I think it's just best to leave it up to the voters and hope for the best, even though sometimes they might not always make the right decision. Because, like, for example, like the people who stormed the Capitol, they were members of the public who, I imagine, like most of them probably voted.
Mr. Budd, you get the final word.
I think it could be a little bit. Sorry, my mouth was muted. I think it'd be a little bit of half and half of the voters' responsibility, half of the politicians' responsibility for deciding what their ethicals are going to be in relations to each other. So, like for politicians, if there is a way that we could set up good ethical people that are in office already. Hopefully those, I doubt, I mean, obviously I don't think they will, because of how Kwibe mentioned earlier that they're just doing it really for themselves. But hopefully there would be some politicians who would stand up to politicians who are acting unethical and try to set a standard that maybe like this place that you're trying to get elected to is for people who are good faith people, good backgrounds, good morals, to set that standard. Whereas how Savannah pointed out earlier, I also agree that it is up to the voters to vote for good people and vote for their representatives who they want to represent themselves. I think it has to take half and half, where you have the voters who need to take the chance that they're voting a good representative in that has good ethics, that has good morals, versus there also needs to be politicians and mentors in the legislature that are trying to help foster that community of good ethics, good morals, to represent the people, to have a good republic. Because there are also a lot of people, there are also a lot of voters who look up to the people who they vote for, who look to them as leaders who are representing whatever they need to represent. And it is important, if they're going to see the people that they voted for, they're going to see the people that are good, fit people leading their country, they will look up to those leaders and be like, hey, these people are acting really well, really good. I want to act like them, and I want to keep voting for people like them. And hopefully, with good ethics, good morals, things are going on. People will get endorsements from those same people that are in office that are keeping, it'll just keep kind of spiraling in a good ethics, good morals constitution of politicians being good people and voters voting for good people.
Well, first of all, I want to thank each of my panelists for joining me here today for our discussion on political ethics in American politics. Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. I also want to thank each of you who either joined us live at home for the broadcast or who end up watching us later on as part of the live stream. Please join us again next week, where we're going to be talking about European-style campaign finance laws and trying to understand whether or not they actually do a better job of promoting democracy than what we have here in the United States. That'll be 9/22 at 8:30 in the a.m. And again, thank you very much, and hope to see you next time. God bless.